novelist and writing coach John DeDakis to speak with us today. He is a former senior copy editor on CNN's The Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer. DeDakis is the author of 4 mystery suspense novels. Bullock in the Chamber, the 4th novel in the Lark Chadwick series, deals in part with the death of John's 22-year-old son, Stephen, in 2011. During John's award-winning 45-year career in journalism, 25 years at CNN, he has been a White House correspondent and interviewed such luminaries as Alfred Hitchcock, Jimmy Carter, and Ronald Reagan. John's father, Nicholas George DeDakis, was a district governor of AHEPA in the Chicago area about 1930. John DeDakis is a writing coach, manuscript editor, writing workshop leader, and has taught journalism at the University of Maryland, College Park, and American University in Washington, D.C. He also regularly leads writing workshops at the Writers' Center in Bethesda and at the Politics and Prose bookstore in Washington, D.C.
Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, about the books that I've written, and I'm going to leave some time for questions so that this can be a two-way street as well, because I know some of you are writers as well and may have some questions about the publishing process. First, I want to tell you a little bit about the name. We pronounce it DeDakis, the long A. That's okay, because look, you're the Greeks, you know how to pronounce this. My dad came over from Greece in 1913, probably a little bit after the Titanic went down. I told him I was glad he missed the boat, because he probably would have been in steerage and would have headed straight to the bottom. The original name was D-E small d A-K-I-S, but there was a typographical error in the Chicago phone book in about 1915, and they accidentally capitalized the second D, and so Papu said, let's keep it that way. So if you see D-E capital D A-K-I-S, then you know it's this strain of the DeDakis clan. So you could probably title this talk From Journalist to Novelist, or How I Learned to Start Making It Up. And I want to tell you a little bit about my background. I come from La Crosse, Wisconsin, which is right along the Mississippi River on the west side of the state, right where it makes the bend in the road there. La Crosse is beautiful. It's about 50,000 people. This is a view taken from the Minnesota side of the Mississippi River, looking east toward the downtown area and toward the bluffs. Granddad's Bluff is probably the biggest topographical landmark in the area. It's a great place to take your date after a movie or something, or maybe not even look, who knows. Heileman's beer is what La Crosse is probably best known for. These are my parents. My dad, Nicholas George DeDakis, he went by N. George. You all know how the names go. His dad's name was George Basil, and so then my dad was Nicholas George. He went to the University of Chicago Law School, and somebody was asking, I don't speak Greek, and it's my fault for 2 reasons. One, I'm terrible in foreign languages, but I think also my dad encountered some prejudice when he came over, and he tried to join a law fraternity at the University of Chicago and was blackballed because he's Greek, because he was Greek, which of course, this is the Greek system we're talking about. So this only shows that bigotry is illogical. It makes no sense. So I think, and I can't prove this, but I think that my dad, because of that experience, really tried to assimilate into the U.S. culture. He didn't have an accent. He spoke Greek. He spoke Greek with my yaya and papu. But he really tried to blend in to U.S. culture. It was probably my mom that was more interested in the Greek culture, and she did Greek cooking and things like that. And my dad taught me, you know, Kalyamata, Kalyaspada, Kalyanikta. That was about it. And I even asked him if that whole experience of being blackballed affected his attitude toward his heritage, and he never owned up to it. Maybe it didn't make a difference, but I assumed that it did, because there was never really a concerted effort to have me get a better understanding of my Greek heritage, other than when I would go visit Yaya and Papu in Chicago, and of course my Papu was the cook of the family, and so he had all kinds of things going on. So I did eat a lot of the fantastic Greek cuisine. My mom was a third grade teacher, and they met on a blind date. My dad co-owned a car with a buddy, and my mom and the guy he owned the car with was dating my mom's older sister. And so he said, "Hey, she's got a sister, why don't you come along?" So they went on a date together. That's how they met. And interesting side story here, when my mom's older sister, when her husband died, my dad died, or my mom died just a few months after him. And so my dad and my Aunt Nita, my mom's older sister, my dad was in Wisconsin, my Aunt Nita was in Texas, and they would call each other regularly to commiserate and encourage each other. And my Aunt Nita told me that at some point, she said, I got so lonely that I got down on my knees and prayed that some nice man would come along, and maybe we would be able to be friends, and maybe something more would develop. She said the next day, after she had prayed that prayer, my dad called and proposed, long distance. So this is an answered prayer, right? So what do you suppose my Aunt Nita said? Let me think about it. So she went to a friend and said, George has proposed. What should I do? And of course, my dad and my Aunt Nita, they'd been visiting each other in their homes. They'd known each other for 60 years. So my Aunt Nita's friend said, well, you should marry him, because otherwise people are going to think you're a floozy. So the next day my dad called and said, well, what's the deal here? And she said, well, George, my friend said that if I don't marry you, people are going to think I'm a floozy. And my dad said, well, Nita, what makes you think you're not a floozy? So she said yes. And that was my dad, Mr. Smooth. So then I came along in 1950. This is me when I was about 5 or 6 years old. We'll move on. Now, the point I want to make in this talk is that life doesn't always turn out the way you expect. Now, in real life, we call those things crises. A spiritual crisis, or a life and death situation. In fiction writing, we call them plot twists. So there have been several plot twists in my life that brought me to the career I had and the writing life that I have now. Now, my plan, my career trajectory was that I was going to be a lawyer like my dad, and the two of us were going to go into practice together. And then, if my career trajectory had turned out the way I had wanted, I would have gone into politics. I would have been an alderman, and then mayor, and then governor, and then a senator. And if my plan had turned out the way I had expected, I would have been the one sworn in on the steps of the Capitol instead of this guy from Kenya or wherever he's from. Although I guess it's official now that Donald Trump has said he was not born in Kenya. So I went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison in 1968. Now, those of you who know your history know that there was something very big going on in the world back then, the Vietnam War. And you think things are polarized now? They were very polarized back then. There were riots at the University of Wisconsin in Madison when I was a student there, and there were riots in just about every college campus because there was a draft. And people were, young kids, 18, 19, were plucked out of society and sent to the jungles of Vietnam. And what really was frustrating to me is that when I would go to class, I would be bombarded from both the left and the right with what I considered to be overheated rhetoric to take a position either for or against the war, never mind not having thought it through. So, and this gives you an idea of there were about 200 kids a week who were being killed in Vietnam, and there were 500,000 U.S. troops over there at the time. So you can see how much campuses were seething. The whole U.S., it was like the country was tearing itself apart back then. So, so I decided to go into journalism because journalism seemed to be the good place to be to figure things out. Because when I would go and have bull sessions in the dorms with my friends, I'd argue the right-wing line of my Nixon Republican parents. And when I was at home at Thanksgiving, I'd argue the left-wing line I was hearing at school. And when I was alone, I was confused. So journalism was the place to be. Now, I got tear gassed covering one of these riots, and my parents heard my report on the radio back in La Crosse. And they said, well, it's about time, I think, that you transfer to a different school. Which is fine, and I did that, but there's one thing you need to understand, and this is one of the plot twists. About the time I was attending the University of Wisconsin, Playboy magazine voted the University of Wisconsin the #1 party school in the country. And I saw it as my personal mission to be the #1 partier at the #1 party school. I didn't actually succeed, but I had fun trying. And the problem is that when they had a draft, as I mentioned, and it's a number system, and if you had a number below 150, chances are you were going to get drafted. My number was 14. So I made the transfer to the University of Wisconsin in La Crosse. I lost 20 credits in the transfer because my grade point average was 1.95. I was about ready to get kicked out of school because I've been spending all my time partying and there are no. I was in a real fix because here's the Vietnam War going full strength. I'm number 14 in the lottery. I just lost my student deferment. So what am I going to do? Well, my dad was on the draft board. So I went to my dad and I said, hey, Dad. And before I could even ask the question, he said, hell no, I'm not going to get you out of this, but I'll give you some advice on what you can do to find out what your options are. And he told me that, if I talk to a recruiter, I might discover that there are a lot of other behind-the-scenes jobs that I could do. So I did, and I discovered that there was something called military journalism. So who knew? So I enlisted. I ended up being stationed at Fort Lewis, Washington, and near Seattle. That's me with my bayonet and my teeth, and the whole John Wayne thing. And while I was in the Army, I was a security risk because when you go into the military, you have to fill out a questionnaire about all the nefarious, bad people that you know. And one of my friends was in a group called Students for a Democratic Society. And the FBI considered this group to be something like Al-Qaeda or ISIS. And for some reason, they decided that I was a security risk. I have no idea why. So they did a major background check on me. And while I was a security risk, you know what the Army had me do? They made me a cook. I could have poisoned the whole company. So I went, the FBI finally said, he's okay. I moved on to Fort Benjamin Harrison, Indiana, in Indianapolis, where I got my training in military journalism. And then I got my orders to Vietnam. By this time, I had decided that I was a conscientious objector. The problem is I hadn't bothered to tell anybody about that, so it's a little late to go, oh, by the way, been meaning to tell you about this burning moral objection I have. So this is another crisis point, or a pivot point, I guess you could say. So I prayed this time, and the prayer was, now what? And I find it interesting that my prayer wasn't, get me out of this. It was, what should I do? And I got an answer, call home. And it made no intellectual sense. Because my parents were in favor of the war. War is good business. Invest your son. That was the anti-war slogan at the time. But I called. Now put yourself on the receiving end of the phone call. I said, Mom, Dad, I've got orders to Vietnam. I'm either going to jail or Canada. Not sure which, but you'd want to know. And this is a lesson, I think, in expectations. Because I expected that my dad, who was a World War II veteran, was going to blow his top. I expected that my mom, who was a third grade teacher, was going to lecture me in third grade-ese about doing my patriotic responsibility. Neither of those things happened. Instead, my dad didn't say anything, and my mom just began to ask questions. She would have been a great journalist or psychologist. She said, how did you come to this conclusion? Why do you feel this way? Have you thought about the consequences? And so here I am in the middle of the night, pouring out my heart, putting into words stuff that had been banging around in my head. And my mom, years later, told me that she was praying that she would say something that would get through to me. And so about 20 minutes into the conversation, she said, I think you know what you're going to do. And I just started to cry because I wasn't really a conscientious objector. I just didn't want to get killed in Vietnam. If this had been Nazi Germany we'd been fighting, sure, I would have been able to do that. I would have been scared to death, but it was a much more clear-cut moral situation. So I surrendered, I accepted my orders to Vietnam, and then here comes the next plot twist. 2 weeks before I was to ship out, my orders were changed to Germany, and I spent the next 2.5 years at the headquarters of the American Forces Radio and Television Network in Frankfurt, Germany, doing interviews for a special events radio unit. My boss, that's me on the left, my boss, Herb Glover, was, he actually he started his career at CBS News with Walter Cronkite and ended his career as the program director of the network. But when we worked together, he was my immediate supervisor, and this is a mentoring moment, and again, another plot twist is coming up, because one of the first interviews that he assigned me to do was with this guy named Alfred Hitchcock. Maybe you've heard of him. But I mean, now think of this, because my boss could have done the interview in his sleep, and instead, he trusted this 21-year-old kid not to screw it up. Now, I'll tell you just a quick Alfred Hitchcock story. You know that he's well known for the movie Psycho, and he told me that he shot the movie in black and white because of the shower scene. He wanted the gore to be more understated, a little more insidious. And you know what he used for blood? Chocolate sauce. Alfred Hitchcock told me, I'm just passing it on. So I spent the next 2.5 years there. I did interviews, and it changed my life because I found something that I was good at doing and that I enjoyed doing. And so I left the Army, went back to school at the University of Wisconsin, got a BA degree in journalism with a 3.5 average. I'm not brilliant. I'm not a physicist. And, but I grew up when I was in the Army. So this is a picture of what I worked in radio for a while, transferred to television. This is one of the early shots. That's a little happier picture. I wasn't quite as strung out. So I worked in television news locally in Madison for about 8 years. Then I went and covered the White House for the last 3 years of the Reagan administration. And this is a picture that was taken by actually Barack Obama's current White House photographer. This is a scene in the Oval Office on a documentary that I was doing on the press versus the president. And so we were in there getting some pictures of that. So then I joined CNN in 1988 as a writer, and I was only there about 9 months or so, working nights and weekends, when one of the editors I worked with said, "Have you ever thought of becoming an editor?" I really hadn't. He said, "You'd be a great editor." What he meant was, I want off nights and weekends, and you'd be a great warm body to replace me. So, sure enough, I said yes, and sure enough, he got off nights and weekends, and I did overnights for the next 7 years or so. I ended my career 3 years ago as one of Wolf Blitzer's editors on the Situation Room. This is a picture that was taken right after we won the Peabody Award for our coverage of the 2008 presidential election that I should have won, but decided for the good of the country not to be involved in it. And so this picture represents the nanosecond that Wolf let me hold on to the stamp. They took the picture and then I had to give it back. Just to give you an idea of what an editor does, because that's what I did for the next 25 years. An editor is like a goalie, only in soccer and hockey, no one, you know, the goalies make all the great saves. In journalism, they don't see you make the great saves. They're only aware of you when something gets through. An error in fact, bad writing, misspellings, bias, those kinds of things. So just to give you an example of one of the scripts I had to edit, it read, "The winds of the tornado were so strong, they suckled the shirt right off his back." I mean, one letter can make your anchor sound like an idiot. I've never heard that script on CNN. But the thing is, editing is tedious. It's not creative. It's fault-finding. So I wrote a book. Now, I wrote a book, but it doesn't just happen like that, as most of you know. This book, it took 10 years for me to get the agent that I've got. It went through 14 major revisions, and the agent that I have and have had for the last 15 years is the 39th agent that I queried. So I learned a lot about the process of writing and rewriting and getting an agent and getting published. This particular one I draw from personal experience. One is a car-train collision that I witnessed as a kid. And this scene is a picture that's a scene from the novel where my protagonist has a showdown with a freight train. And I was lying on the tracks in front of the train. Most of the shots we weren't able to use because they were too blurry, because I was jumping out of the way of the train. The full disclosure, this train was stopped. So it was a little easier to get the show. The other thing I draw on is the suicide of my sister about 36 years ago. So the point here is, and again, you know, grief is another turning point in a person's life. And in this case, it was carbon monoxide poisoning. And the interesting thing is that I pulled two things together from my personal life to get this story started. Because I was doing a writing exercise about a personal experience about this car-train collision. And this is significant in terms of how your subconscious informs your writing. As I was writing the facts of this personal experience, I remembered a radio news report I had heard at the time of the car-train collision 40 years earlier, in which an infant survived a car-train collision. And I began to play what if. What if that kid grew up and wanted to know more about her past? And so the first scene is my sister's story, my sister's suicide, but the book isn't about that. It's just that those personal events sort of inform the story as it goes forward. The next book is I write a series, so the protagonist goes from one story to the next, even though I write them so each book stands alone, so you don't have to read them in order or anything like that. And I'd written about 5 drafts, And part of the book is set along the Inca Trail to Machu Picchu in Peru. And I was looking on the internet to get pictures of the Inca Trail to get a feel for it. And I realized I can't fake it. I need to go. So I went there and I knew what the murder scene looked like. And when I saw that, that's the murder scene. And when I took it, I knew I had the cover of the book. And so they used it on the cover of the book. And that's proof that I actually hiked the trail. I wouldn't be able to do it today, but I did. Third novel is Troubled Water, and I'm selling them all here. You don't have to buy them, but it will be gas money to get back to Baltimore where I live. And let me just tell you a quick couple of things about my family, and then I want to open it up for questions. This is the family. My wife Cindy, somebody's a singer in here, Stella sings. And I met my wife in the church choir in Madison, Wisconsin. I joined the church choir just to get involved, and she became the new choir director. That was 39 years ago, and I've been taking direction ever since. And I'm no threat musically. Cindy just retired a year ago from National Cathedral, where she worked with the children's choirs, the boys and girls choirs. My daughter Emily is next to her. Emily got a PhD in creative writing at Queen's University in Belfast, Northern Ireland, where she works now at the Accidental Theatre as a dramaturg, basically the go-between between the playwright and the director. My son James, with the other guy with the beard there, he's a drummer in Los Angeles, and his band composes music that they use on different television shows on TV. Like they just sold one to This Is Us. I think that's the name of the show on NBC. They just sold a song to them. Next to me and next to James is my son Stephen. Stephen also is a musician and a cook at Black's Restaurant in Bethesda and at Addie's Restaurant near the White Flint Mall. Is that where it was? Yeah. I think it's closed now. Unfortunately, Stephen died of a heroin overdose a little over 5 years ago. And again, you write what you know. And so what I did, I went through grief counseling for about 2 years. And through the entire time that I was going through grief counseling, I was writing my 4th novel, which just came out in October. And if you can't see it really well, that's a bullet in the syringe. Because I knew heroin was an issue here. He was missing for a week. And 3 days after he went missing, I came up with the image of the bullet in the syringe. Because heroin is that Russian roulette powerful. And I would like to see it that people who are caught pushing drugs, heroin, that the guy who pushes the fatal heroin overdose should be charged with second-degree murder. Because in my opinion, it's like selling a pistol with one bullet in the chamber to a person that you know is going to play Russian roulette, and you don't care. That's second-degree murder. But as I found in my research, easier said than done. And so that's a subplot for this particular novel, which is set at the White House. I used to cover the White House. And so my protagonist covers the White House, first day on the job, and there's an attack on the briefing room. The president's missing, the first lady's life is at risk, and her boyfriend disappears. So I bring a lot of personal experience to this. And I should tell you one other thing. I write as a woman in her mid-20s. Don't ask me what I wear when I write. I want to tell you just a little bit about this. This is a paperback edition, the first paperback edition that came out that my publisher envisioned. It's the same book in a magazine format, easier to carry around. The text is in columns, so it's a little less daunting. Wolf Blitzer did a really nice blurb for me. But the coolest thing about this book, my picture is bigger than Wolf Blitzer's. So I will stop and take your questions. I hope I didn't talk too long. But I want you to respond to whatever concerns you've got about your writing or journalism or the election or whatever.
So how did you get involved in the Writers' Center in Bethesda?
I do teach writing workshops at Politics and Prose and at the Writers' Center in Bethesda. And I was at a book fair in Kensington, Maryland, and Alan Orloff, who is a colleague of mine in the Mystery Writers of America, we were at the book signing table together, and he teaches a class there and told me about it, and I just told him who I was and what I do, and the rest is history.
And tell us a little bit more about finding an agent. You said you have gone through like a 10-year process to find your agent.
I did, and it doesn't necessarily have to take that long. I mean, I had, a full-time job and family responsibilities and things like that, but, and I'm a slow learner. And I met my agent at the University of Georgia at a writers' conference, and it was the same writers' conference that I went to for 7 years, but I finally realized, why not query the agents who are going to be there before the conference? And so I sent the agents who were going to be there an email, a query letter in essence. This is who I am, this is what I've written, I'm going to be at this conference, I'm looking forward to meeting you. And I met 2 agents at the conference who wanted to represent me, and one of them in particular fell in love with my writing, and so you got a date, but then, that's how somebody falls in love. So she fell in love with my writing, and we've been together ever since.
I have another question, sorry. Okay, so you said you did 14 major revisions. Did you do it all on your own, or did you use like a program or an editor? Or how did you go about doing your revisions?
One of the things, probably the main thing I did with the revisions is that you can only do as good as you're only so good, and you're right. Writing, as you know, is a very solitary, lonely experience. And the only way you're going to know if your writing is resonating or connecting with someone is to share an early draft and get feedback. And so I wrote the whole thing first before I started to show it to people, because you need to trust your own judgment before you let yourself be driven and tossed by everybody else's opinions. So I did it as good as I felt I could, and then I had other people read it to give me their feedback. And one of the things I learned is you listen to what people are saying. You don't argue with them about, well, if you'd read chapter 5, you would know that. No, you don't argue with the people who are giving you feedback, because they're telling you what doesn't work. Because you're so close, intimately close with your manuscript, you can't see things as objectively and as fresh as a fresh pair of eyes. And so over the years, I have, especially because I write as a woman, it's very important for me to have women in their mid-20s read my manuscript to tell me what's working and what's not, and then make the revisions and do that. So that's the most important thing. I didn't rely on a program for the first 3 books, but I did use a program on the 4th one, the most recent one, because it had been so long since I've written one and I was out of practice. I used something called Storyweaver, and it was good just for getting ideas. And one of the things that I took away from that was it made me think in terms of universal themes. And that's a really important backdrop for any novel, because a universal theme like friendship or love is something everyone can relate to. And then it's just a matter of packaging it in the specific ways that relate to your story. And in my novel, Bullet in the Chamber, the emphasis is on love versus control. And a lot of times people say they love someone when they're really just saying, I want you to live life my way, not your way. And so there's always that friction that takes place, especially in male-female relationships.
And what you see as a parent now, that you lost actually your child, due to drug abuse, whatever it is. What do you think actually there are some solutions to this problem, and what is the best way to approach that? Because it's very dramatic, really. extremely traumatic. As a parent to lose your child, the grown-up.
If I understand your correction, you're saying that what's the solution?
No, what is some of the best solutions that you could
What are the
address
best solutions to the
big,
drug
very
problem?
big problem.
It is, and my book doesn't presume to answer that. But I have thought about it. I mean, the initial impetus for writing it was that I believed that the heroin pusher should be charged with murder.
Absolutely.
But law enforcement is only one element of the whole problem. And you've got prevention that's an issue. You need to try to do something to keep people from using drugs. You need to deal with the grief aspect of it, because the heroin abuse has risen. Like the fatal heroin overdoses in the last 5 years have gone up 200%. The latest figures that I just saw from the CDC. It is an epidemic. It's a scourge. It's everywhere. And addiction is, you need to be able to treat the addict and not treat him as a criminal, but treat him as someone who's addicted, who's got, who can't help themselves. It's like alcoholism. And so there need to be ways to help people who are addicted. There need to be ways to help people who have been incarcerated to re-enter society and not have a stigma attached, so that they can be productive members of society and not re-offend. There are so many areas that need attention that it's really almost intractable unless everybody comes together. And I'm not under any illusions after this last election that people are ever going to agree on anything, even basic facts. So I think we have a long way to go to solve the problem. And my book is not meant to preach or to send a message. It was a catharsis. It was just an opportunity for me to write what happened, but to put it into a bigger story that's more entertaining. And grief is one of the things I do talk about now, in hopes of being able to destigmatize the issue somewhat. Because, I don't want my son to be defined by how he died. He was a good kid, but he made a fatal mistake. And so I talk about it because I'm able to. There are so many people who are so overwhelmed by the experience. I know people are going to judge me as a parent because of how my son died, but if you're going to judge me, get in line. I got there first. So I'm able to handle the stigma and the pain, in a sense, on behalf of other people. It's a long answer. Sorry about that.
No.
Yes, ma'am.
I just would like to comment on that. I would completely agree with you that I think a drug addiction and the serious end that you encountered should be really not just treated as a singular, individual problem or family problem. It really should be considered as a community or societal problem, and we all should be we are part of the problem and part of the solution. So that's how it should be. But beyond that, I just wanted to comment on that. And beyond that, I wanted to say, or to ask you, you mentioned that in your decision to become a journalist first, you were interested in the aspect of truth, or finding truth, and seeing journalism maybe as a way of gaining truth, or method to gain truth. And I'm wondering, how you see really fiction. Do you see it contrarily, or do you see it connected, or even a higher step towards truth?
That's an excellent question. The question was, if as a journalist I'm interested in truth, does that contradict being a novelist, or does it enhance it? Is that another way of stating your question? I would say that it's a little bit of both. I mean, it was hard for me to give myself permission to make things up that never happened. But on the other hand, I am drawing on some very real things. And a lot of people come to me wanting me to edit their memoir, their personal story. The problem is, if it's really going to be an interesting story, chances are you're saying some bad things about people in your life, and you might get sued. And so my suggestion is to fictionalize it, camouflage a lot of the key things, like the villain, change what the person looks like, their gender, change the locale, change their profession, camouflage it in a way that no one can say, ah, that's me, and you slandered me or libeled me. But you can still tell the truth of the story, even though you've taken liberties to create something that's a little more interesting. That is one reason. The other is, if you're doing a memoir, you only have your own point of view. And in order to tell a story factually and thoroughly, you need to have much bigger perspective than just your own blinders, your own narrow tunnel vision. That means you have to interview other people. It means you would have to interview the villain in your life, and good luck getting that interview. So, you're going to realize very quickly that you don't know as much as you think you know about what the big picture of the story is. Another reason to tell it fictionally, because then you can make things up, and you, in a sense, can get a better understanding by imagining, by putting yourself in someone else's shoes and trying to understand how and why they acted a certain way. Does that answer your question?
Sometimes I see that when you read a publication, like a very notable publication, and I might not quote any writers or any people that actually did the writing, but it always seems to have the same style. How do they do that?
You're talking about
The Economist, for example.
Right. I mean, your question is the writing style that seems sort of similar all the way across the different publications and stuff?
No, in one publication that doesn't quote who has written it.
Oh, I see. Right.
How do they manage to make it look like the same person writes everything?
How do they make it seem like the same person wrote everything? There's a certain voice in the way you can tell a story. And if you can crack the code in terms of the way you write, then it becomes a rhythm that you get into. And so the more you read stories like that, the more you start to hear those voices when it comes to telling the story that you have. Not to mention that there are style issues. Each publication has a style guide in terms of how they present things and different words that they use and don't use. And so there's some sort of uniformity, not just within a publication, but even across the board. There is a certain style of writing in journalism. Probably to summarize, I mean, one thing is to write tight, because space and time are limited. But that principle is transferable to writing a novel. You may write 400 pages, but if you can keep your sentences tight, you're keeping your reader engaged. So I had a journalism professor who had something called the fog index, and he used it on the lead sentence of a story, which the lead is generally the most important thing about the story, and then the subsequent paragraphs expand and give context to the lead story. And the fog index was basically some sort of mathematical code based on the number of words in the sentence, the number of syllables in the words, and then you divide it by whatever. So the lower the fog index, the clearer the writing. You don't want to have big words. This is why Donald Trump is an incredibly effective communicator. Now, what he says is entirely different things, because he makes stuff up. But he is effective because he usually uses simple words, repetition, 1 or 2 syllables at the most. That's effective.
He doesn't spell well, of course, the words.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, never mind the words may not mean what that's a whole different thing. Yes, ma'am.
Did you ever self-publish any of your books?
The question is, have I ever self-published? I have not. But self-publishing has become much more accessible. It's much easier now to self-publish a book. And there are strengths and weaknesses and advantages and disadvantages of self-publishing as opposed to going the traditional route. And that's one of the writing workshops that I lead. But my suggestion is that, if possible, try to get an agent. Try to write well enough so that someone who's not related to you, or is your best friend, whose job it is to tell you how wonderful you are as a writer, if you can attract a professional in the business with writing that's effective and engaging, then that puts you, farther along. One of the problems with self-published books is that places like Barnes & Noble and the major chains generally don't carry them, either because they're not returnable, or because they're riddled with typos and didn't have any editorial oversight. So, if you've written a terrible book, you can throw it up on the internet or you can have it published, but that doesn't mean it's good. And there are something like 300,000 books a day that are published. I mean, the numbers are astronomical. So your responsibility, whether you get a mainline publisher or not, is that you need to be the one to promote it. Gone are the days of big budgets for promotions, unless you're John Grisham and you don't need it. The rest of us poor schmucks have to burn, do what you can to get interest in it, and so it's sort of a blessing and a curse to do it self-published. But you can get your book out there self-published. Yeah.
Okay, so let's go to the revisions. What maybe 3 or 4 things that stood out that when you did? Because I'm in that stage. I'm doing revision. What did something like click and you said, oh yeah, I should have done this from the beginning? Was it like the hook? Was it what stood out for you that got you your agent?
Probably the biggest change. I mentioned getting feedback from other people. Probably the biggest and most helpful feedback I got was my first novel was not. It wasn't happening. I was getting rejections, and I got one rejection that was really helpful. Because most rejections, if they bother to tell you anything, they'll just say it's not for us. Well, that doesn't help. But this guy said, it's not a mystery, it's not literary, it's not a romance, I don't know what it is, so I don't know how to promote it. And so I went to the book club that met in my neighborhood when we lived in Atlanta. They read the manuscript over the summer, and then 25 women let me sit in on their critique while they took apart my book. Talk about daunting. There are 2 main things that I learned. One, remember I needed to understand how women think. There was a snippet of dialogue. There was a snippet of dialogue where my character says, "I'll just jump in the shower and I'll be right there." These women said, "We do not jump in the shower. We savor the experience." So my character does not jump in the shower. The other thing I learned is that as I listened to them talk, the things that they objected to helped me realize that I had 3 subplots that I didn't need, that I could extract. And by getting rid of those things, I then had, the novel went from a 150,000 word mishmash to a 75,000 word mystery novel. And that was the pivot point. That's when I realized I had pay dirt and I could go forward. Yes?
You mentioned that you got a rejection and you learned from that. Mm-hmm. What if you don't get anything? Why?
There are still some people I'm still waiting to hear from someone. That was 20 years ago. I'm still waiting. You move on. You keep a log. I kept a log of everyone I sent a query letter to, and then I kept track of what I sent, who I sent it to, when I sent it, and what, if any, response I got. And you can send out query letters to a gazillion prospective agents, and you only need to really worry about being loyal to somebody when they start to pay attention and want to start reading some of what you've written. And if you get a digest or a directory the literary agents. If you go to Amazon.com and type literary agents in the browser, you'll get a whole list of directories. And the directories will tell you who the agents are, what genres they represent, so that if you've written historical fiction, you don't want to send a query letter to someone who handles romance novels. That's a waste of time. So it'll help you weed out the people, weed in the people who are going to be receptive. It'll tell you how they want to be approached. Chances are it's by a query letter. It's probably okay to give them an email. And there are probably in some of these directories guidance on how to write an effective query letter so that you can get the attention of a prospective agent. Because usually it's the query letter that makes them determine whether or not, that's your calling card. That helps them know how well you communicate, how clearly you can communicate what your book is about. And a lot of agents will make a decision either because maybe they have too many clients. Maybe there's a problem in the way, maybe there were too many typographical errors. Maybe you didn't approach them the right way. There are any number of reasons. And so a lot of people get rejected before anybody's even had a chance to read your writing. It's not fair, but it's a business. And they get hundreds of queries a day, so they've got to make a decision like that as to whether or not they're interested in learning more. And chances are, if they're interested, they'll just want to read the first chapter or maybe the first 50 pages, because then they'll know how well does this person write, how quickly does this person get me into the lives of the characters. One mistake a lot of people make who are beginning writers is that they front load so much backstory into their novel. They're telling the story instead of showing the story. You don't want to front load it and tell everything. You want to have people talking with each other, and you unspool the story as people talk to each other, because that's the way we live life. And so you want to sprinkle in all of the backstory as opposed to just throw it down on the page all at once. I'm probably telling you more than you need or want to know.
What services do you offer? Do you do editing? So can you tell us a little bit what you do? Because there might be some people here interested.
Yeah, and I've got business cards that I don't think everybody has yet, that although my contact information is on there. I do several different things as a manuscript editor. Some people hire me to be their coach, and it's usually like a set fee for like 5 hours of, depending on what your need is. Another thing I do is I'll do a manuscript assessment, sort of a flat fee, and I'll react to it as a reader will. I won't get all the nitpicks in there, the misspellings and things like that. I'll give you my reaction to how it feels as a story. I do line-by-line edits. That gets a little pricey, and if you've just done a first draft, it's too soon to have me do something like that, because I'm doing the nitpicky stuff and the big stuff, down to spellings, punctuation, all that kind of stuff. And then I also do something called a weed whack. That's basically, there's a friend of mine who wrote a memoir that was like 900 pages. I mean, he wanted to do it in like 3 installments. I said, man, Nixon's memoir wasn't even that big. So, but he was too close to it. He didn't know how to telescope it. So he hired me to just weed whack. I didn't rewrite the novel. I just got rid of a lot of the stuff that he didn't need so that we were able to tell the key story. So that's another thing that